Days before the deluge smashed through the Libyan city of Derna, a local poet attended a meeting with officials to discuss the possibility of floods and the state of the nearby dams, which were supposed to provide protection. He wrote these words afterwards. The rain exposes the drenched streets, the cheating contractor, and the failed state. It washes everything, birds' wings and cat's fur, reminds the poor of their fragile roofs and ragged clothes. It awakens the valleys, shakes off their yawning dust and dry crusts. The rain, a sign of goodness, a promise of help, an alarm bell. Like thousands of others, on Sunday, the poet Mustafa al-Trabelsi died in the floods that his words had predicted. His poem is now being shared across Libya as people there begin to grapple with the scale of the loss and the apparent culpability of those in charge. I'm Niall Paterson, and in this edition of The Daily, we take you to what remains of Darna. Now, as you might understand, there are communications issues when dealing with this particular part of the world at the best of times. In the aftermath of a flood like this, there are bound to be some issues. So I'm going to ask you regular daily listeners to bear with us. We do have, though, on the line, Alex Crawford, our special correspondent, who is on the ground in Derna. Alex, just tell us what you can see.
It looks as though a whole mountain of bombs has been dropped in the middle of a city centre. There are upside-down cars, vehicles. I saw one car that was on something like the 6th floor, inside a house. It had wedged up against the stairs. I've seen the tops of mosques that have been ripped off. I've stood on the foundations of a whole block, a 9-storey block of flats, and I'm on the foundations of it. It's just been completely whacked out of the way by this water, this tsunami wave. And then when I look out from those foundations, I can see the remnants of other foundations of other blocks, like 3 or 4 of them, massive big apartment blocks that were filled with hundreds of people, dozens of families. It goes on for miles, Neil. It goes on for absolutely miles. It's very wide and it's very deep. It comes down from the mountain and then it has cut this huge, great big scar through the city centre, and huge, great big bridges have been upended and moved. So the whole of the bridges are down. You can't see any bridge. It's just extraordinary. I went down to the port. I walked all the way down with my team, Chris Cunningham and Jake Britton, the cameraman and the producer. We took quite a while to get down there, and it was just street after street, house after house, shop after shop, each one of them telling a tale of utter chaos. Down at the port, they're digging with diggers because they're still turning up bodies. I think one of the most upsetting sights I've ever seen, I can't imagine what it must have been like for a mother or a father to look on that, see their child being dug out by a digger. They don't know that there is a child in there, but it turned out as they were digging all this massive debris, we saw these tiny legs flop over the side of the digger. I think it was a little girl, maybe about 10 years old, 12 years old. Mm-hmm. And these rescue workers who are doing the most grim job rushed down to the coastline to wrap her up in a body bag and raced her to a waiting ambulance. There's obviously no chance of her being alive, but it's just some sort of semblance of bringing dignity to this poor little girl.
Of course.
It's one of dozens that they're still pulling out of the water. There's an Italian naval ship that's parked off the coast, and it's just on the lookout for bodies. There are little dinghies all floating around, searching for bodies that have been washed out to sea. And then you'll see buildings that have got huge, great big bullet holes in them. You're reminded that this was a city that was once taken over by Islamic State.
Alex, explain the geography of Derna, this city, this port city, surrounded by mountains, and there are the 2 dams that kind of were supposed to protect the city. Explain exactly what Storm Daniel did.
Storm Daniel was a force that ripped through a number of Mediterranean countries, particularly Greece. Several days before it hit this part of the world, and eastern Libya, there were a number of warnings around the world that it was heading this way. It led to a huge mountain of rain, which filled up these dams. And they talk about hearing in the middle of the night the first dam exploding as it took on so much water. The dam couldn't hold the water anymore. That water cascaded down to the second dam, which was further down the valley, and that then imploded and unleashed this huge torrent of water. They're calling it a tsunami. They're describing it as a disaster of biblical proportions. And honestly, that's what it looks like. It looks like someone's just thrown the center of the city upside down and just let it all land.
Are we, Alex, any closer to a definitive death toll from the huge flood of water that went through this town? If you were in its path, you stood precious little chance, and this was not a small city.
This was not a small population of about 100,000. I'm just getting Chris. Sorry, what Chris is talking?
That's Alex just talking to our producer, Chris Cunningham there.
There's lots of shouting. I heard it in the background. I wasn't sure what it was. Chris tells me that they think they found a woman who's still alive. Now, that would be extraordinary. I know that we might be losing the signal, Neil, but if I just walk down just so I can see a little bit of what's happening. There are people running towards a building dressed in hazmat suits. It's quite a lot of excitement because if anyone is found alive, it would be against huge odds. This temperatures have been extremely high. And all the corpses that they've been finding, I haven't heard of any live survivors in the last day or two. I'm heading down to where the rescue workers are working, and I'm walking on
I think we might well have lost Alex Crawford there, as you were hearing. She was heading down to where there were reports of someone being pulled from the rubble alive. Now, that would be a remarkable achievement 6 days on from Storm Daniel and the floods that have absolutely ruined this town. But again, I hope you understand that the communications to this part of the world, especially at a time like this, are not going to be very good at all. We will pause there just for a moment. Coming up next, we will return to our correspondent in the field in Libya. It does sound like we have just lost the line to Alex Crawford, but handily enough, our Africa correspondent, Yousra Elbagir, is also on the ground in Libya. Yousra, where are you at the moment?
We are at one of the last standing hospitals in the city where ambulances just keep streaming in. There's a high number of volunteers here, but also people who are coming to visit their loved ones who are currently being treated, but also men in hazmat suits and wellies who are transporting bodies out to mass graves higher up in the mountains.
When you say that people are being brought in numbers to this clinic, to this hospital, are these people that have been pulled from the rubble, or are these people who have simply been injured by the floods, by what resulted from Storm Daniel?
It's both. It's people who are being pulled out of the rubble. I mean, they do need to be brought to hospitals before they can be taken off for burial. And then there are people being treated here who were injured on the day. I mean, it wasn't just the torrential rainfall. It was buildings collapsing. It was obviously the dams bursting. It was like 100 ways to get hurt that night. So people here are suffering a plethora of injuries. And obviously unfortunately, many more people have been swept out to sea, and people that we will never find, at least 10,000 missing.
Do we have anything close to an official death toll? Clearly, numbers will change over the coming days, but what is the latest from what you've been hearing?
I mean, the numbers are spiking. We went from at least 5,500 yesterday to now 11,000, at least 11,000, just in Derna, just in one city. And that's terrifying. It means that there are many more bodies to be found. It means that as the waters receded, they exposed just how tragic and catastrophic and deadly this event was, but also that there are bodies buried by the silt that these waters carried. And that's where we see the diggers on the ground and this mass effort to shift soil and silt to try and get to people who might be buried quite deep in the riverbed.
You mentioned those mass graves, and indeed the huge numbers of people who will, unfortunately, that will be their final resting place. One detail which seems to have been emerging from Derna is the idea that there has been a lack of body bags, and given the temperature, that is obviously going to pose a risk to sanitation, particularly in a place where clean drinking water is also at a premium.
So we hitchhiked up the mountain to a mass grave site, and we went up with a truck that was carrying material. Volunteers en masse have been carrying material around the city to try and at least give people, a respectful burial. And as we were driving up there was a massive truck with men in hazmat suits. What they've done is they've perfumed the body bags, because at this point, the scent is incredibly pungent. It's really, you can really smell the rot of the bodies. This isn't just like, an earthquake where bodies are being pulled out from dry rubble. These are bodies that are bloated from the water and they're decomposing. So there are these perfumed body bags that are being transported up to designated mass grave sites. The one we got to was actually being expanded. When we got there, there were diggers on site, shifting sand, shifting soil to get these bodies buried, and a number of volunteers, one as young as 23 years old, who said that it is so incredibly painful to do this, to bury his fellow countrymen in this way, and women, and you could just see it in his eyes. And a 23-year-old, Neil, I feel like right now we're dealing with the immediacy and the urgency of this, but the scars, not just infrastructurally and in the landscape, but just in the hearts of the people here who've lived by the water for so many generations, and now have had their city be destroyed by it.
Yousra, just a reflection though on the infrastructure, in particular those two dams, which were supposed to stop water which flows directly through the city, as I understand it. A river runs straight through the middle. Those two dams designed to stop a flow of water that could prove dangerous to people living there. What do we know about the state of those dams and the reason for their collapse?
The dams have seen very little to no maintenance. And you have to remember that Derna has endured years of Islamist extremism. It's endured the brunt of Libya's civil war from 2014 to 2020. I mean, even now, just walking along the coastline, there are still buildings here that have bullet holes in them from the civil war. So these dams were really low on the priority list of things to fix. But also, Neil, the National Meteorological Institute here in Libya warned of this, and has been warning. Even last year they warned that flash floods might be there's a massive risk of flash floods, especially considering how poorly maintained these dams are. And there was even talk of maybe blowing up these dams with TNT, according to residents here. They were like, what's the solution to these dams? And now the worst has happened. These dams have eventually collapsed. We did go to the site of Wadi Darna Dam, and Safwat, 24-year-old teacher who lives on sort of the higher plane of the valley overlooking this dam, has grown up looking at this dam, said, we now call this the dam of death. Said Sad al-Maut, that this now is a symbol of catastrophe, and we will never forget what's happened to us. And the dam, if you see it, it's broken apart. It looks like it's been, I think not just one or two bulldozers, it's just been completely broken through. There's bits of concrete flung around on the riverbed, and the riverbed just has this tiny, meager stream running through it, nothing's even happened. Now, this valley is usually dry. Libya is a very dry place. The coast is no exception. Usually it's not at capacity, and when it is at capacity, there are buildings built on the cliff quite high, and when you stand where we were in the middle of the valley in the riverbed, and you look up and you see how much water this valley dam structure has the capacity to hold, just makes you realize the amount that must have just come rushing down to break not only one but two dams and then just destroy the city.
Yousra, it would be difficult enough to deal with a disaster like this if there were a functional government in place. But currently in Libya, there are two barely functional governments. Just explain for people who don't know the intricacies of Libya, the power structure that affects the country, and who technically should be in charge of all of this.
mean, the Eastern authorities, Libya was after the civil war split in two. You've got the UN NATO-backed government in Tripoli, and you've got the General Haftar, the notorious General Haftar's militia-backed government here in the east, where Benghazi is the capital. The Eastern authorities are in charge, Neil. There's really no simple way to put it. They are responsible for alerting people. They are ones responsible now for helping people. The military is deployed here. General Haftar's military is deployed here right now. We're in the field hospital, and a military truck is driving through just as I'm talking to you. We've seen military around town. We've seen the Libyan Red Crescent around town, but the initiative has been very local. We've met volunteers. There are people from all over. We've seen people from the west of Libya who are from Tripoli, who are from the other side of the fence, so to speak, who are here to help. And when we were on our way in, we were told by people here that everyone's come together to try and solve this crisis, that this is, in a way, in the most, horrible way, that this has kind of created a sense of a greater cause. This is a fracture in a country that can't afford to have these kind of political interplay. You can hear the ambulance now. The political interplay when there is so much at stake. And this tragedy is a very prime example of that.
When we are hearing calls from both the Western and Eastern administrations for a public inquiry. I do wonder, however, whether the questions, at least in the short term, should be around why aid was not able to get to this area just as quickly as it could. I understand from Alex Crawford that we are now seeing international aid agencies, international volunteers on the ground helping out. But you guys managed to get there before they did. How was that possible?
When we started covering this morning, bright and early, there was no one there. And then through the day, they've kind of trickled in. There's a lot of hesitation with coming here. You just don't know what you're going to get. You don't know if you're going to be received, if you're going to be arrested, if you're going to be harassed. There were reports that photojournalists that arrived before us were harassed and arrested at Benghazi airport. We luckily had a much better ride of it. And I think there's an increasing awareness that they need to open up, that they need to let people in, that they can't do this on their own. And so I think the first day, Darna was inaccessible. We didn't even know, we had no clue what was happening here. And then the next day we start to see videos pouring out, and we start to understand the gravity of it as as the internet is restored, as people are starting to see kind of local initiatives and recovery work. And now it's opening up further. And this is great. This is really great. But unfortunately, there are thousands of people who could have been saved, who now died preventable deaths because they were not seen to during the golden window of search and rescue efforts that we all know very well is 24 hours at best.
And given the instability that exists in this country, there are two countries almost, you have to assume that moving forward, as we learn more about the failings at the dams, the warnings that perhaps the Police and Security Directorate were directing people to stay indoors on the night of the storm, this is going to be used by the politicians, isn't it? It always ends up being used by the politicians.
Definitely. I think it's a matter of time before things start to change very quickly, before our welcome expires, before there starts to be kind of a political message around this. But I think as of now, needs must. There's a reason why people, again, are apprehensive about coming here. It's because it's not a welcoming place. It's a heavily militarized place with, run by a general who has committed atrocities left and right. So who knows what will happen? We've seen what politics has done, and it's led to this number of deaths because of the fact that there's been such a disenfranchisement and a lack of interest in providing basic infrastructural maintenance and care for people here in a port city that is fairly well off compared to parts of the country. So, what will it look like after this when there's actually no Derna of which to really invest in long term?
Yousra, just casting your eyes around where you are now and where you have been over the past 24 hours, have you ever seen anything like this?
Never in my life, Neil. Never in my life. And it's not just, it's the scale visually, it's the scale when you know the number of lives, and it's the smell, and it's the feeling of this like early stage of grief where people still are just reacting. They haven't registered, they haven't processed. When we were on our way here, someone said, this isn't a natural disaster, this is a catastrophe. And I don't think I could really grasp it until we arrived. And I really could see, this is a catastrophe. And the only thing we can do is just make sure people understand just how bad this is and what the scale of this disaster really is.
My thanks to Yousra, to Alex, and of course their teams of producers, fixers, camera operators and drivers. And once again, apologies for the communications issues throughout this episode, but I'm sure you'll understand why. You'll also recall that we lost the line to Alex just as she was hearing that someone was being pulled alive from the rubble. I'm sorry to say that turned out to be a false alarm. Not that the people of Darna are anywhere close to giving up hope. Not yet anyway. That's your lot for today. We'll see you next time.